She murdered over 650 young people, tortured hundreds, bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would keep her young forever. And the worst part, she was royalty. This is the story of the real vampire who inspired the darkest legends of Europe. And all of this really happened. Hungary, Iwu. Elizabeth Báthory is born into one of the most powerful families in Europe. Her uncle was king of Poland. Her cousins were princes and dukes. She grew up in massive stone castles, surrounded by unimaginable luxury, absolute power, and a hereditary madness that poisoned her lineage for generations. From childhood, Elizabeth witnessed scenes that would become nightmares. At the age of 4, she saw a gypsy sewn alive inside a dying horse and left to suffocate. She saw torture as casual entertainment at dinner. Her family tree was steeped in darkness, murderous uncles, aunts practicing black magic, cannibalistic cousins war-drank blood in rituals. At the age of 15, she was forced to marry Count Ferenc Nadasti, a savage warrior known as the Black Knight of Hungary. He spent months fighting wars, leaving his young wife completely alone, isolated in the massive Szeged castle, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, surrounded only by dark forests and whispered legends. It all began. Elizabeth's obsession consumed every hour. Eternal beauty, youth that would never fade. She spent entire days staring into Venetian mirrors, examining every angle of her face, terrified of finding wrinkles. One day, a maid accidentally pulled her hair while combing it. Elizabeth exploded in fury and slapped the girl so violently that blood splattered on her own pale face. And then, at that moment, Elizabeth had the revelation that would condemn hundreds of innocent souls. As she wiped the warm blood from her skin, she became convinced that her face looked younger where the blood had touched, softer, more radiant, as if the blood itself possessed magic. She believed she had discovered what alchemists had sought for centuries, the secret of eternal youth hidden in innocent blood. Elizabeth began her reign of terror methodically, targeting those without voice or power. She sent servants to neighboring villages with promises of work, food, warm beds, and steady wages. Poor and desperate peasant families sent their daughters to the castle with prayers, but none ever returned. They vanished without a trace, swallowed up by the castle walls as if they had never existed. What went on within those walls was beyond any nightmare. Elizabeth built an elaborate torture chamber in the deep dungeons. She beat the girls with clubs until their bones shattered. She used red-hot pokers to burn the flesh. She cut off fingers one by one with scissors, collecting them in jars as trophies. In her most delirious moments, Elizabeth would bite chunks of flesh directly from the faces and bodies of her victims. She would tear flesh from shoulders, breasts, and cheeks with her own teeth like a rabid animal. And through each torture session, she meticulously collected every drop of blood in silver basins. Not a single precious drop could be wasted in her dark ritual. After each murder, Elizabeth performed her unholy sacrament of youth and vanity with religious devotion. She filled entire bathtubs with fresh, still warm blood and submerged herself completely. She drank it like wine. She rubbed it into her skin for hours. She applied it to her face and neck like sacred cosmetics blessed by demons. Her husband Ferenc knew everything that happened within the castle walls. I could hear the screams echoing. I saw the bodies, smelled the blood, knew about the disappearances and the torture chamber, but he never tried to stop his wife's madness. In fact, he encouraged her obsession and even taught her new, more efficient torture techniques before dying in battle. With Ferenc's death in 1604, Elizabeth lost her last limit. She had no one above her, no authority to answer to, no power to fear. Her lands were vast, her wealth limitless, her noble name untouchable by law. She began killing with terrifying frequency, sometimes torturing 5 or 6 girls in a single bloody night. The screams of dying girls echoed through the mountain valleys. Local villagers heard the cries and whispered in terror about what was happening in that castle. But absolutely no one dared investigate or confront a countess so powerful that even bishops trembled. Elizabeth did not commit these atrocities alone. She surrounded herself with loyal and twisted accomplices. Ilona J., an old nurse who managed the kidnappings. Dorco, supposedly a witch, who taught blood rituals. and 2 male servants who did the brutal work of capturing, restraining, and disposing of the broken bodies. Together, this macabre circle formed a death cult operating within the castle walls for decades. They threw frozen bodies out of windows in winter for wolves to devour in the snow. They buried bodies in mass graves in the dark surrounding forest. They hid remains in the castle walls, under floorboards, anywhere to conceal their monstrous crimes. For more than 20 years, absolutely no one could touch Elizabeth Báthory. She was too noble, too rich, too politically connected, too protected by her aristocratic lineage. Families of victims desperately tried to report their missing daughters to priests and local authorities, but they were ignored, dismissed as hysterical peasants, or directly threatened with violence if they persisted. The Catholic Church suspected that something demonic lurked in that remote mountain castle, but they were terrified to accuse someone so powerful, someone whose family had connections to kings. Elizabeth seemed above the law, above God, above any form of human responsibility or divine retribution. But then Elizabeth's arrogance led her to make a catastrophic and fatal mistake. She grew more audacious and reckless. Convinced of her own invincibility, she began kidnapping not only powerless peasant girls, but daughters of lesser nobles and minor aristocratic families, girls with surnames, with fathers who had some influence and access to the royal courts. These families had something the murdered peasants never possessed: voices that could reach the king's ears. They had political connections, legal resources, and social standing to demand investigations without being ignored. And they began to pressure King Matthias II of Hungary to finally act against the bloody Countess. In December 1610, on a frigid winter night, Count György Thurzó organized a surprise military invasion. He was both Elizabeth's cousin and the Palatine of Hungary, bringing soldiers and legal witnesses. When they burst through the castle gates, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. A girl lay dead in the entrance, completely drained of blood and still warm. They discovered another girl dying in the dungeon, tortured beyond recognition. Several girls were locked in underground cells, emaciated and brutalized, waiting in utter terror. In the following days, investigators found bodies buried within the walls, hidden beneath the castle. Remains thrown into pits in the forest. Rooms filled with bloodied torture instruments, and Elizabeth's personal diaries describing victims in grotesque detail. During the trial, witness after witness confirmed the same terrifying truth. Over 25 years of systematic murder, Elizabeth Báthory had killed more than 650 young women, 650 lives destroyed, 650 families shattered forever by one woman's sick obsession. Elizabeth's accomplices faced brutal and swift medieval justice. Ilona J. and Dorko had their fingers torn off one by one with red-hot pincers. Then, still screaming, they were burned alive at the stake in the town square. The male servants were publicly beheaded, their heads displayed on skewers. But Elizabeth herself, despite the overwhelming evidence and her own written confessions, was too noble to be publicly executed. King Matthias II could not allow a royal lineage to be tainted by public trial and execution. This would set a dangerous precedent threatening the entire nobility of Europe. So her sentence became something far worse than any swift death. They would wall Elizabeth up alive inside her own castle, burying her alive in the chambers of horror. Royal stonemasons sealed every window and door of her room with thick bricks and heavy mortar. They left only a tiny crack large enough for food to pass through. No light, no visitors, no mirrors, no mercy. She would rot in the darkness and silence. For 4 agonizing years, Elizabeth existed in that stone tomb of her own making and crimes, without natural sunlight, living in perpetual darkness and growing madness, without human contact except for silent food deliveries. Most cruelly, without mirrors to obsess over her reflection, the vanity that murdered 650 innocent. On August 21, 1614, servants found her body collapsed on the cold floor. The vampire had finally died at the age of 54. But the legend of Elizabeth Báthory never died and only grew darker with each passing century. Some swear that her ghost still haunts the ruins of Lactus Castle, eternally searching for mirrors. Historians debate whether she directly inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. Vampire legends exploded across Europe after her, spreading like a plague through folklore, all traced back to a real woman and her bloody obsession with eternal beauty and youth. If this story shocked you, leave a like. If you want more dark stories of royalty, subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, which Dark Queen or King do you want to see in the next video? Until the next Royal Shadow, if you dare.